everyone's like fed and awake. Exactly. Oh, I'm not that clever. So I love this topic, and the reason why is because it's something that's not well taught at all in medical school, in residency, um, and and not well understood. But as a surgeon, I think it's really important that we understand the instruments that we use, because ultimately that's what's going to make you a better surgeon, make you a safer surgeon, um, and ultimately, yeah, avoid injury. And this is just a small preview, because the no matter how many times I hear this talk or give this talk, it's it's something you can just kind of hear over and over again. And there's a reason, we learned physics to get right our MCAT exams, and all of that was forgotten. So this is like me reaching back to some real basic concepts here. Uh, so again, this is a small preview, and if you come to the ESS, the self-injectome course, then you'll get some more. So again, my disclosure. So my objectives for you are for this talk is to understand the basic differences between the energy that we use: monopolar, what's cut, what's coag, and bipolar energy. To understand how these settings relate to tissue effects, and ultimately to make you a surgeon. All right, this is about semantics, but it's important. So this is cautery. So cautery is actually taking a heating element and branding like something. Electricity is, as you know, electricity. Electrocautery is then using an electrical current to create heat, as opposed to having direct heat application. And this is electrosurgical energy. So it kind of got ingrained into me in my fellowship, because everyone calls it cautery, but it's actually not cautery. It's electrosurgical energy. It's actually the correct terminology. And so I share that information because that was something that was probably hammered in my head for 2 years. So electrosurgical energy, which is what we're talking about, is using alternating current to cut and coagulate tissue. And even those words aren't the best words, and that's where I'm going to talk a little bit. Some basics of electricity. So in order to understand electricity, we're going to really go down to basics. So electricity is the process of moving electrons, and as we know, electricity always seeks the ground and seeks the path of least resistance. And resistance is going to play a key piece. So current is how fast those electrons are flowing over time. The circuit is our pathway. Resistance is any obstacle to the flow of electrons. So whether it's the tissue properties itself, fat, water, or things that we've done to increase resistance, such as char. And voltage is the force that is generated to overcome that resistance, and power is the work over time. Now, I have a question for you. When you, on your generator, when you set it at 30, 30, 40, 40, whatever you set it at, what are you setting? So again, I want to show of hands. So how many people say it's volts? 40 volts? A few hands. Okay, how many people say it's 40 amps? And we got a few hands. And then how many people say it's watts? Okay, so we're fairly even, which is really kind of interesting, because again, this is something that we do every single time when the OR, that we don't even know what that number actually means. So the answer is watts. So that's what you're saying. So what you're telling that generator is, I want a certain amount of energy over time. And so as I mentioned, it's an alternating current. And we're going to get back to that question, but here's another question for you. So if it's alternating current, like you use like when you plug something in, why is a patient not electrocuted during electrosurgery when the setting now that we use, it can go up to 300 watts, up to 9,000 volts, when our sockets are only 120 volts, right? So the reason has to do with the frequency of operation. Same reason why we don't get electrocuted by the Wi-Fi waves going through the air and our TV signal. It has to do with the frequency, and it's above that of stimulation. Any stimulation that you get of nerves or anything like that is due to a direct effect. So it's not due to the surgery. Otherwise, the patient would be like twitching off the table, and it's not because they're under anesthetic either. So to understand electrosurgical energy and how it works, as I use this analogy, so think of the generator as a water pump. And what you're telling that water pump to do when you set the voltage is you're saying, I want you to pump out a certain amount of volume of water every minute. So you set it at 40, you're saying no matter what, I want you to generate 40 liters a minute of water coming out of that pump. And the voltage is the amount of work that pump has to do to pump out that water. And the resistance is then that resistance to flow, so that it's the diameter of that pump. So if you can imagine, if you have a really large pipe and you're pumping water through it, then to get that to pump, then that pump doesn't have to work very hard. But if you're to achieve that 40 liters a minute with a big pipe that's flowing, you can flow nice and slow, or even just think of a river. It's just like tons of water is going through, but it's not going very fast. But if you say, I want you to pump out that same amount, I'm going to increase the resistance. Resistance is proportional to the diameter, or the radius. So then you have to generate a lot more work to achieve the same amount of voltage or amount of power that you've set at. So when you say 40 watts, it's saying no matter what, I want 40 liters a minute going through. So the more resistance you have, the more that pump has to work. And this is going to come into a point of safety. Now, the difference between the pump and our analogy is we also have these things called return electrodes. So it's not the grounding pad. It doesn't go to the ground. It's the return electrode. So what that is a safety mechanism that says to the unit that I'm pumping out water and I want almost all of that coming back to me so I can keep pumping it through the circuit. Because if it's not going into the patient, then it's going somewhere else. If it's not coming back to me, it's going somewhere else. And then I don't want to give you any more water because I don't know where it's going. You're causing a flood somewhere. So that's what the generator is saying. And the safety mechanism is that the monopolar unit is a circuit that requires that energy to come back. The difference between a bipolar unit and a monopolar unit is that here you have a circuit that goes around in a circle. With the bipolar unit, the pathway is within the instrument itself. So it goes along one end of the instrument, and then because it's two poles, positive and negative, crosses the instrument and comes back to the generator in that same way. So you actually don't need a return electrode when you're using bipolar energy because it's not part of the circuit. The return is through the instrument itself. So that's what it means when they say bipolar versus monopolar. So now what's the difference between coag and cut? Cut is for cut, coag is for coag, right? That's how most people know it, right? So I'm gonna blow your mind. Okay, so the real problem actually came when whoever came up with this device, because the cut and coag are actually really bad terms. And I think the fact that these terms were put on the generator leads to the problems that the incorrect usage that we face today. And so the way I actually want you to think of it is what's called modulated and unmodulated. So unmodulated currents is what we call pure cut, meaning that when you activate that pedal on a frequency level, it's on all the time. It's constantly delivering energy. Whereas the coagulation mode is what we call modulated current. So what that means is that the generator on a coagulation mode is only on 6% of the time, and the other time it's off. So if we go back to our pump, what it's saying is that, again, when you set that at 40-40, when you're using the cut mode, the unmodulated mode, it's saying, okay, I want you to 40 liters a minute, and you can just pump all the time throughout that minute. But when you put on the coagulation mode, you're saying, I still want you to pump up 40 liters per minute, but you can only be on for 5 seconds out of that minute. So what happens during those 5 seconds, right? That pump is working really hard to increase the amount of force that it's having to generate to meet that requirement that you set. And in electrosurgical energy, anything that where there's large forces of energy being put through is a higher potential for a injury related to electrosurgery. And so this is just an example of just showing you that waveform, how it's different, is that if you look at the peak voltages that are achieved during the two different modes, whereas the cutting mode it's fairly uniform, with the other mode, with the unmodulated or the cut mode, you're increasing it, or sorry, the coagulation mode, you're increasing it significantly. Now, what waveform is bipolar? Is it like the cut or is it like the coag? Or so how many people say it's like the unmodulated cut current? Okay, and then how many people say it's like the other one, the modulated? All right. So what bipolar energy is, it's like cut. So a bipolar energy is equivalent to using your cut mode or your unmodulated current. So I'll show you why that's important. So what happens with the voltages is that when you use it, because you achieve high voltages create char. And so if you have the same setting on the different modes, what you see a difference between the pure cut and the pure coag is that with low peak voltages, you have nice sort of smooth cutting through because there's not much of these peaks in energy that are going through, is that where you get these high spikes in voltages that leads to high char. And where this really comes into play clinically is you get those bleeders. I think everyone has had this. Okay, so you have a little vessel that's bleeding, and then you get someone to pick it up with a forceps, and then you're like, okay, buzz me. And then so when you buzz it, it's like, what do you touch with the cut or versus the coag? And so what happens is that you're like buzz, you cook it, it's all charred, and then you're like, what the hell? It's still bleeding, right? Like, why is it still bleeding? Like, is it because you didn't cook it long enough, or did you maybe let's just crank up the energy? Is that going to be the right answer? And so the difference has to do with these two modes, this cut versus coag. So a thing to remember is that the tissue effects is related to energy over time. If you apply a high amount of energy, then that quickly heats up the tissue, and that creates a lot of char. And char is an area of high resistance. Whereas if you heat up something slowly, it's going to slowly denature and slowly dry out the tissue. So the analogy that I'm going to give you, this is going to, I hope, stick with you. Okay, it's like a turkey. Okay, it's Christmas Eve. You're like, you gotta make a turkey, and you're like, oh crap! It's like, you have guests coming over in like 3 hours, and you're like, crap! I forgot to put it in the oven. So what do? Right? You stick it in the oven, crank up the energy, and it'll be done in like a couple hours straight, right? No problem. Everyone's like, right? What happens if you do that? Right? You're gonna have a charred turkey, right? But what's that turkey gonna be like on the inside? Raw, right? Well, how do you cook a turkey? Slow energy over time. So heating a vessel is like using slow energy over time, okay? So what happens with a cut mode, 100% duty cycle, is that you get gradual desiccation of the tissue, which allows you to have deep penetration down into the vessel or whatever it is that you're coagulating. On the other hand, is that if you use the coagulation mode, because it creates this high spikes of energy, it heats it up really quickly, and it creates char superficially. So you think that vessel is nice and cooked and burnt, but really deep down, you haven't actually got to inside of it, and that's why you still get bleeding. So the better mode to use if you have the vessel and you're buzzing yourself is cut mode. Now it takes slightly longer. You gotta be patient, but which is hard to do sometimes. But that's how you get the penetration down into the tissue. Okay, if you don't like turkeys, the sausages, Same kind of, I was just trying to come up with our same deal, right? More char bleeding inside, because I like this one because it's actually bloody inside, or versus, cook it nice and slow, energy over time. So the tissue effect that is desiccation, right? And desiccation. So instead of saying cut versus coag, what I'm trying to get you to understand is what's the actual tissue effect. So the tissue effect of the two modes is desiccation. So desiccation can be achieved either with a cut or coagulation mode, but the effect that you achieve depends on which one you do, and it has to do with that cycle that it's on and off. So either if you touch the tissue and you hit that cut button, then you're going to get a slow desiccative effect over time that has a deeper penetration. Whereas if you hit the coagulation button, you're going to get more superficial char, but not very deep. Now, there may be times that may be the effect that you want. So it's not to say that one is right or wrong, but it's to say that it's understanding what the tissue effects might be. So we're going to go into another one called vaporization. So vaporization is only achieved through the cut mode. And what that is a high spike in energy that's so if you heat it rapidly, you get char, but if you heat it really rapidly, then basically you cause the water molecules inside the cell to expand so fast that the cell bursts and it vaporizes. So that's vaporization. And vaporization is a function of something that we're going to introduce called current density. And so what current density says is that you can have the same settings on your machine, but how you affect the current density can affect the tissue effect that it has at the end. And so the current density is proportional to the surface area of your end instrument. And so the narrower you make that end instrument, the higher the current density. And so if we go back to our pump analogy, what the current density is the end of a hose. Okay. So again, let's say you have a watering hose, and again, so it's turned on, it's coming out at 40 liters per minute, but you're like, it's not, the flowers are over there, like it's not getting very far. So how do you make it go further? How do you make it come out stronger without cranking it open more? Put your thumb over the end, right? So if you put your thumb over the end, right, what happens? You increase the current density, so the amount of the force that's going through, or the voltages that's going through, is increased. So that's what vaporization is ultra high current density. It's like because your vaporization is you don't touch the tissue, you're just off the tissue, so it creates these the gap is created just by sparks. So the sparks are ultra high current density, which is like getting that 40 liters a minute through like a little pinhole opening. And so you can imagine the force that would just have to pound through to be able to achieve that. And then so much just kind of like blast things away. So that's what vaporization is. So again, where this plays into effect, that has to do with, again, the different types of tissue that you use. So people always ask, what setting do you use? And the correct answer is, well, the setting is the lowest power to achieve the desired effect. So in things like plastics, where you're using the needle tip energy, you're having a very high current density. So your energy settings are going to be much lower to achieve that same tissue effect. Whereas a lot of things like in gynecology, when we do roller ball ablation, you have these big balls which has high surface area, the current density is low. And so in that sense, then we have to use higher energy settings to get that tissue effect. Now, you guys all know about pad burns, right? Right? Return electrode site burns. Why does that happen? Does anyone know? Right. So you have to remember that current's always flowing around the patient. So what happened is when those pads came off, that only a tiny bit was touching, what you were having is in that one area, you're having an area of high current density. So the tissue effect wasn't at the instrument that you were using, that tissue effect was happening in that area of highest current density. So you have the same energy flowing in your circuit, when you're activating your return electrode, as you do on the tip of your instrument, as you do through that whole pad, except what's happening in that entire pad is that energy is dispersed, so it's not causing any problems. But as soon as that peels off, that causes that area of high density, and that's where that is. Now, modern electrodes now have this little gap in the middle that says that where it's not connected by energy, so both sides actually have to be touching. If one side comes off, then the whole circuit shuts down. So that's why these things don't happen anymore, because before we used to have a single pad, but now we have this, all the return electrodes have a split down the middle. And if you look at the ones in your OR, you'll notice that. You should notice that. I don't think there's any place that's not using that standard. So that's why the burns happen. So the setting, so just remember that the energy setting that you use is proportional to the tip effect that you're going to use to achieve that desired tissue effect. So as that end electrode size decreases, your power requirements are also going to decrease. You can even achieve the same effect without even with the same instrument. So a lot of people use this hook, right, when using a monopolar hook. And so just by using the very tip of the hook versus the side of the hook versus the back of the hook, you can actually alter that tissue effect to say, if you want to vaporize something, you can use just the tip of it and get very high current density, versus something if you're desiccating it, you have a little bleeder, you can touch it, use the back end of something and use a lower current density and get a more desiccative effect. Now I'm going to show you this, this is the scariest example that I found, a demonstration of current density and how it plays into injury. Okay, so watch this, okay? He's activating it there. Look at that. Okay, that's how injuries happen. If you have an area in your circuit of high current density, higher than your return electrode, that energy is still going through, it's finding its way through. So that area of high current density is the area of potential injury. Just like when you have a laparoscopic instrument and you have a little hole like in the insulation, that's an area of high current density. So it's not, the energy isn't going to go through the electrode, it's leaking out through there, and if that's touching something else, that's how an injury happens, because it's that high current density that's going through there. So again, the way you minimize that is to always use the lowest energy setting that you need, because if there is any other circuit of an area that you may not be aware of, at least you're trying to minimize the amount of energy that's going through. So we have desiccation, we have vaporization. The last one we're talking about is fulguration. So fulguration is, it's still creating that gap, but because you have, if you have the cut mode or the unmodulated current mode and it's on all the time, it will rapidly heat up and it will vaporize. But if you have that modulated cycle, which is only on 6% of the time, and you apply that high burst of energy, what it does is it creates char superficially, and then it doesn't allow that deep penetration, because now that superficial char is an area of high resistance. So fulguration is useful for those areas where you want to achieve a effect of controlling bleeding superficially, creating that char, but you actually don't want any depth of penetration. So we have desiccation, vaporization, and fulguration. And so the desiccative effect, remember I said that the desiccative effect is an unmodulated current. You can achieve that with a bipolar device or any of the monopolar on any setting. So that one's probably the one that's most universal. The vaporization is only that cut mode on the monopolar that really allows it to rapidly heat the cells. And the fulguration is the coag mode on a monopolar instrument. So it's not cut versus coag, it's desiccation, vaporization, fulguration. What's the tissue effect that you're trying to achieve, not the button that you're pressed in trying to do it. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about bipolar energy. So bipolar energy, as I mentioned, is an unmodulated current. And one of the things a lot of people talk about is this thing of thermal spread, because you guys have been exposed to like a lot of these advanced thermal or these advanced energy sources. They're all based on bipolar energy. So like the ligature and gyrus and all these other things, they're all advanced bipolar devices, but they're all based on the same technology, and they all talk about thermal spread, thermal spread. And so the question is, well, what's thermal spread, and then what creates thermal spread? Because that'll be important if you're looking at this or trying to understand why someone says this is better than the other thing. So thing to remember about with the bipolar energy is that, again, so you have an instrument with two electrodes, positive and negative, and then you have some sort of tissue in between. And so when you activate that electrode, then as that creates a desiccative effect, you're creating an area of high resistance. Now, as long as you have that instrument on, the electrons are still going to try and flow across that gap. And as I said, electrons always seek the path of least resistance. If it doesn't go directly across the gap, which is now desiccated and now an area of high resistance, it's going to go around it. And then as you sequentially go around it, that's where you get this idea of thermal spread, because the electrons are creating a desiccative effect beyond the poles of the instrument that you're having in place. So how do the advanced bipolar devices do this? Well, they all have various forms and ways in which they do this. But on a basic conceptual level, what they've done actually on the electrodes, instead of having a pure negative and positive electrode, is that they have actually interspersed the negative poles with the positive poles on the same electrode. And what that does is that creates within the instrument itself, it creates a much more narrower area where the energy can travel. And so what that does is that it confines the area of tissue effect to the instrument itself and not far beyond it, because you have these polarizing poles that, or these poles that are the same, that basically repel each other and prevent things from going further. And then some of them also do other kind of measurements, like they measure tissue impedance, because the other thing is too is like it's saying like once you have resistance, what the safe devices will do will say, if you get on a monopolar device, there's nothing coming back to the machine that stops you, that shuts it off. It just, as long as you're pressing the button, you're hammering the energy through, and as long as it's coming back, it'll keep pumping out that energy, except it spreads further and further. What the advanced bipolar devices do is they measure the impedance. They say, hey, I'm starting to see some impedance to flow, and once it hits a certain level, it says, okay, now it's time to shut off, instead of keep trying to push it through, because you keep trying to push it through, it's going to go around. So that's how these devices work and how they work for safety. So what I'm trying to get at is that there's a whole bunch of variables that are impacting tissue effects. So it's not just about the setting that you use on the machine. It's not just about the wattage. So it's the wattage, it's the mode form that you use. From a purist point of view, I just use either pure cut or pure coag, because I know, again, what those modes are. The blend modes are just some mode in between. So the coag mode is the modulated version, which is only on 6% of the time, and then the cut is on all the time, and the blend modes are just somewhere in between. But to really get that effect is that I think the simplest conceptually is to use the cut versus the pure coag. I talked about the distance versus the tissue, so you can have the same tip, and if you use your cut mode on a tissue, if you're touching it, you get a desiccative effect. If you pull away, you get a vaporizing effect. You can change the size of your instrument tip, keep everything else the same. If you change the tip, it's going to get a different effect. Bipolar versus monopolar. I'm going to show you a little bit about the technique and other patient variables that come into it. So ultimately, the mode that you use depends on the patient. So as I mentioned, fat has a higher impedance to flow. So you're going to need more energy, more power to be able to push through to get the same effect as you would in a thin person. So in someone who's obese, you do need to use higher energy settings to get through that adipose tissue to get the same effect that you see in someone else who's not as thin. And that really has to do with the water content of the tissue. So I'm going to show a short video. These are from some of my mentors in fellowship, and it's demonstrating a BSO procedure, and it's not necessarily about the technique of this video, and I don't think they were even aware of this. It was more when I was giving this talk and watching this video. It's actually a great demonstration of the variations in the tissue effects, and how you can do that in surgery. Okay, so this is just doing your basic anatomical survey. So this is a Roby bipolar device. It's a Maryland tip bipolar. So again, there's some thermal spread. So now here's the monopolar device. So you can see if you touch the tissue more closely, you'll get a little bit of what we call a desiccative effect, like the end of it. But for a second, if you're further away, then you get what we call vaporization. So if you're touching it here, it kind of just dries it up. That's desiccation. So if you back off just a little bit, you get that vaporization effect. Everyone see that? I can play that part. I can play that video again too, if you guys want to see that. But that's the basic concept behind it. So what this is showing here is that when we do the surgery, we create a window to isolate it from the ureter, because one of the things that we're worried about is thermal spread, especially with the use of bipolar energy. So in a second here, you're going to see them identify the ureter, but watch this bipolar device and watch the thermal spread and watch what happens when you first activate it. See that? So that's that thermal spread, because it kind of brings up all the tissue because it's spreading beyond the tip of the device. Now when it uses it a second time, that big contraction doesn't happen because I've already created an area of high impedance behind it that prevents it from going in that direction. And now you actually see it goes, the tissue effect goes the other way because it's not going in the area where I've already coagulated. So now watch this. This is another real cool thing. Okay, so this is that area of high current density. I don't know if, okay, I want to back it up because I don't think you're, I thought, see where they're using the device and see where it breaks. Okay, so right here, so they're coagulating there, but where it breaks, did you guys catch that? Okay, so where they were using the device was because the electrons have to go somewhere. It's not a circuit. So the area of highest current density was not the area of where they were using the device. There was an area elsewhere. So when they applied that energy, what happened was that the tissue effect happened somewhere else. And again, in this case, everything was fine, but in other cases, that could be an area of injury that could happen if you thought you were away from the ureter, and then that area where it broke was actually close to the ureter. That's how injuries happen. I'm not going to play the second half of the video. I'm just going to open it up for questions because there's a lot. Any questions? So with the vaporizing, there's the least amount of spread there. Yeah, because it's focused, because it's just a high energy right in that one place. Yeah. People at the back and here, just maybe stand and speak loudly or please. Yeah. I was just wondering, so when you use the Roby and it all kind of contracted, is there any way to avoid that contraction? Or not really? It's kind of hard. The real answer is not really, because again, with those devices, with just plain pure bipolar devices, to understand that you are going to get thermal spread. Because it's just the way those devices work, because those electrons are still going to find their way around. Now you can use a lower energy setting, so that is safer. So I often use for something like this, I would use an energy setting of 30 for my bipolar device, because that's 30 watts is probably enough where I want to heat it up slowly, and then again I want to get that deep penetrative effect, and then that can at least limit the effect of the spread that you have laterally, at least the damage that it causes. Now, the other thing is just to be aware of what's around you and to understand that yes, that contractive effect does happen, because that's what thermal spread is, and so that it contracts because the tissues beside it desiccate, so it contracts, and that's why you get that effect. So it's just to be aware that happens. So anywhere we're using the energy, if you're grabbing onto something, then you have to be aware of the tissues that are around it, because that can cause a desiccative effect beyond it. Now, again, other devices like ligature or other advanced bipolar devices cause less of that effect because of the way that they work, but it's not zero, and so you still have to be careful. So it's not to say that anything in here was unsafe, that you had that contractive effect, because it's just to be aware of that it's actually happening, and as long as you're doing it in a safe manner, it's okay. But it's to be conscious of it, especially where if you're working near dangerous structures. If you have bowel adhesions nearby or something like that, then you have to be aware of the effect that it's having on the tissue. And sometimes then if you're close, that's where you take it down with scissors or something like that.
Last question. Okay, can you give us some examples of electricity mistakes or misunderstandings that you have seen or heard about? Things that we should maybe be thinking about as we wrap our minds around it.
I mean, the big thing is the cut versus coag. Like again, when you're getting that bleeder, like you're holding the vessel in your pickups or in your hemostat, and you get someone to touch it to you, then that's where the better mode to use, the safer mode to use is the cut mode, because you want that deeper penetration. Now the other thing I love, for example, is everyone's like, everyone has that habit where you touch it and then you're like, oh, there's a hole in my glove, right? Why did I get that burn? It wasn't because of the hole in the glove. Because why didn't the patient has a giant hole in their glove, right? So and the patient's not covered in latex. It's not that it was area rubber. What was happening was that you had, if you're holding by a small amount, then the amount that you're holding that instrument and someone touches you, that's a high area current density that's going through you. And if you touch the patient, then that creates this spark that happens around your hand. And the hole is actually created secondary to an area of high current density, an alternate path that was going through you instead of the patient. So the safer thing to do is, if you're doing is a bleeder, is you want to shorten the distance. The safety thing is you want to use and it's usually because they use coag mode because of those high peaks of energy. So you want to use a cut mode. You want to, if the person holding it, you want to hold on it with like, at least not like this, but at least have enough of a surface area so you decrease the density for yourself. And just apply for a minimal amount of time and apply below the instrument, not above, so that you don't become part of the pathway. But that's how those things happen. It's not because the hole is low. The hole came after. Answer that question, right? Chicken or the egg, right? The hole came after.
I said
okay.
One more question.
It was really comment on if somebody wraps the wire around the feather down.
Yeah. So I've got some good demos for that later on. But basically what happens is that wire is not a perfect insulator. So it's like your hose, like your pump, having all these little micro perforations, and water like this slowly leak through. So again, what's happening is if you're wrapping your instrument around the hemostat, there's actually electricity that's flowing through that it's not 100% insulator. You have electricity flow. And so again, yeah, you can burn the patient or you can burn the drapes if you do that. So you shouldn't do that, because especially if you're activating your instrument for a long period of time and it's not going, like, you're not touching anything, it's going to leak through. And that's the other thing too, is like a lot of people, they activate first and then they touch. So again, it creates that big jump of spark, because as you get close, it jumps. So the other safety thing is, if you're buzzing that vessel, is touch, then activate, not activate, then touch. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Okay, just a quick poll here. When people saw the topic of electrosurgical energy after lunch, who thought it was going to be that fascinating?
That was brilliant. Thank you very, very much. All right, so we have one talking about brilliance. We have another brilliant speaker coming up, and Dan Wissenlaw does not really need an introduction, but I have to say that my job was to take the many accomplishments and what she's done in the area of obstetrics in Canada and on a global scale, and try to pare it down, but at least so that you knew who was going to be on the podium speaking to you today. Until April 2017, Dr. Wissenlaw served as the site executive at BC Women's Hospital and Health Centre and vice president of Provincial Women's and Newborn Health of the BC PHSA, or Provincial Health Services Authority. Since stepping down, she has continued her clinical work and continues as a clinical professor at UBC's Faculty of Medicine. She continues to serve internationally as well with the Canadian Network for International Surgery, and I know we'll hear about that later on as well, providing capacity building and skills training in several countries, and serving as director of women's health programming for that organization. She spent her career advancing women's health in British Columbia. Her 25+ years of accomplishments, and I'm going to just pare it down here, but you'll know her as president of SOGC, expert advisor for the Canadian Institute for Health Information for Maternity. She was on the BC Consensus Panel for cesarean sections or cesarean birth. During her long career, she's delivered thousands of babies in British Columbia. And in recent years, some of the many awards and distinctions she's been given include YMCA Woman of Distinction Award in Health and Wellness, in BC, the Community Service Award, the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, the National Leadership Award for the Federation of Medical Women, and just recently, and perhaps most notably out of them all, is the Order of Canada, because of her work in obstetrics nationally and internationally. Her work in preventive healthcare, combining maternal and newborn mortality and promoting human rights, is her passion for helping others. She's done multiple roles in this area, including establishing emergency obstetrics care in Africa. She has obviously unwavering passion and dedication to this field. And so when I asked her, what the heck do you do when you're not doing all of that? She's like many of the speakers, I couldn't think of anything that she thought was unique. Of course, I have a special bond with her because she's from a small community just down the street from the Sagamore First Nation where I'm from, and that's Blind River in rural Northern Ontario. But then she says, oh, well, you know, I do things like I play the harp. So I told her one thing, that's amazing, and I've never met a harp player before. So up to talk to us today, or in this session, is surgical OB pearls, alarm update, intraoperative active hemorrhage, third or fourth degree tears, the dreaded angle extension, and I'm sure many other things, as we probably pummel her with questions and tap into her expertise. Dr. Wissenlaw. We're neighbors. Yeah.
Do you have slides on?
Yeah. Are they on?
I'm not sure. Here's the one we call it. What was the title of yours?
Yes. I did send it in last week.
So yell at them. If you have it over there. But
That's okay. You can find it in my computer. Sorry about this, guys. It's wonderful. Hi, everybody. How are you doing? Great. You look very comfortable, and I have to tell you something. I'm not going to let you stay comfortable for very long. And in fact,
I also have to apologize for the fact that as I was thinking about this talk and thinking about it really as a breakout session, I wanted to do some very practical examples of things. And when I found out the group was going to be a little bit bigger, I thought, oh, what the hell, I'm still going to do what I plan to do anyway. So what I'm going to do is go through a few slides once we find them. And then I'm going to actually take you through some demonstrations about some various things. And so I'll just take a second and, yeah, I think it's actually up. Yeah. Yeah. There we go. Perfect. Oh, no. Okay. Yeah, just end. And then from, there we go. Yeah, I got this. I'm usually self-sufficient, but it's always nice when somebody's here to talk. So Alison, just for the record, so we're also on webcam just for the people who are watching remotely. I'm going to go through some slides and then I'm going to move over to the demonstration center. And I was going to go back, I was going to talk about one thing, then move over, do the demonstration, come back and forth. And then I thought, realistically, I'm going to talk a little bit and then move over there. And when I move over to the demonstration center, what I want to do is for you all to come up and sort of gather around, and I'm going to show you a few things that I wanted to show you. And so I hope that's okay. If anybody has trouble standing up for 10, 15 minutes, feel free to bring your chairs up as well. But what I will do is move that into the center and then have a circle of people around it. I hope that's okay, but that's my plan. Okay. So when Stuart asked me to give a talk today, it was partly because I was here yesterday doing a full day course for this Canadian Network of International Surgery called the Structured Surgical Obstetrical course. And there are several people in the audience that were at the course yesterday, at least 3 or 4. I will tell you that there's a little bit of redundance from what you saw yesterday in some of the models, but there's also some new stuff. So I hope that this is not boring for you. But he asked me to talk about some surgical pearls, and then the topics, you started to send in the topics. Or maybe they were suggestions from last year, but one way or the other, there was a number of things that came in. And so I wondered how I would possibly, in half an hour, talk about, well, the whole alarm curriculum, third and fourth degree tears, bleeding in obstetrics, et cetera, et cetera. So what I did is I chose a few little things that I thought would be very useful to you, but I really do want this to be interactive. And what I'm really going to try to do is finish up my slides in about 10 or 12 minutes, do the demonstrations in another 10 or 12 minutes, and leave at least 15 minutes for interaction with the audience. So that's sort of what I have in mind, okay? So some very quick slides to start, and then on to the demonstrations. Okay, everybody's with me? Good. Okay. So this session, as I said, it's really not a didactic lecture, so thank you for not expecting that. And it's sort of funny, when I think about being the one based in Vancouver and everything, I'm the one with the low-tech presentation today, Marius, for sure. So in fact, it's very low-tech, as you'll see, very practical. But I did want to cover those things. One of the things that came up, one of the questions that came up was the idea of gentle C-section. So I thought at the end, if we have a few minutes, I'll talk a little bit about that. I don't know whether everybody saw that piece on CNN, but it was pretty hilarious. And yeah, so first of all, I did want to start by saying thank you to you. And when I'm saying that because I can tell you, as president of BC Women's for the last 9 years, and as Kim Williams from PSBC, she actually reported into me as well, so I was responsible for PSBC as well. And I'm in awe of everything that happens with everybody that does work and I know that many of you are from outside BC, and of course I'm in awe of you as well. It's just that I know the people from BC a little bit better, and I know what you deal with, and I understand the geography of this country, partly because I was from a remote part of Northern Ontario. And just one little vignette before I move along. When I was home in Blind River about 8 years ago, and my husband had a bike accident and had a very serious pneumo, and the family doc in Blind River had, with the radiologist in Sudbury using fluoro, got that chest tube in my husband's chest, which saved him being transferred to Toronto. So, I mean, it's happening across the country. There's wonderful things going on. And I really do believe in my heart of hearts that the future of Canada has to do with enhanced surgical skills from docs who have the skills that you have. And believe me, you have the full support of the department and we will do everything we can to help you, as you can see from my colleagues here today. And I'm so thrilled to be here today with two of my very favorite colleagues, both Marius and Niraj are very dear friends of mine. So start with a little clinical example. I'll go through this few slides, and then, as I say, I'd love to hear about your concerns or your cases or anything you want to discuss. We'll try to do that. Third and fourth degree tears had shown up as the number one thing that people wanted a little bit of information about. It's interesting, and just a couple of slides, and then a couple of facts, and then a couple of demonstrations in a minute. So interesting, in the world literature right now, the cross-reference is to obstetrical anal sphincter injuries. And so if you look up OASIS, you'll get the whole body of literature from the UK, and it is brilliant. And I was going to actually download a video of a beautiful fourth degree tear for repair for this talk today. And then I thought, you guys can do that anytime you want. And it's about 5 minutes long, so I didn't want to take the time to do it. But it's amazing the stuff you can get online. And the UK is doing some fantastic jobs in terms of actually getting some of that stuff online for popular consumption. So just mention that. How many people here deal with fourth degree tears in their community? Has anybody not had that? No. So it's one of the things you really do worry about, right? And a lot of the literature now actually lumps third and fourth degree tears in together. So as you're looking at the epidemiology and everything, it's getting a little harder to tease that apart. And we know that when we look at the number reported, we know that the trend is upward, but we think that's partly because people are actually realizing that there's a fourth degree tear and reporting it, as opposed to what used to happen was that many tears were unrecognized. So that's just one thing that I wanted to mention about that. The most important point about a third or fourth degree tear is that you have to have the exposure, and that often means having the analgesia as well. So those two things definitely go together, but if you don't have the exposure, then you really need to get into a situation where you have the exposure to do that, and that may mean going into the OR. It may not be. It may not be necessary. Just a few little things that I wanted to mention. I'm not going through the whole repair of it because I know that it's something you do, but I will mention 2 or 3 of the biggest mistakes that are reported and that I've seen myself in my clinical practice. First of all, when you're doing the mucosa on a fourth degree tear, you really should not be using figure of 8s. Does anybody know why? Tissue ischemia, exactly. So that in the middle of the figure of 8 is actually, you're going to get a little bit of tissue ischemia, and then you may get a little pinhole at that point. So avoid them. Simple interrupted is the best way of doing it. And you know what the number one mistake people make? Well, the number one mistake is not recognizing you have a fourth degree tear. But the next most common mistake with the fourth degree tear, you're not at the top of the incision. So you leave, and this is going to be a recurring theme in everything I talk about today. You're doing a repair and you're leaving a gap at the top. So it's that pinhole at the apex of the tear, whether it's the fourth degree tear, whether it's the cervical tear, whether it's the corner tear, whatever it is. So you need to be sure that you're above the limit of the tear when you're doing that. And then, of course, if you have a fourth degree tear, you'll almost always have a third degree tear as well, and so you're repairing that separately. The biggest thing I think that we do make in terms of the big mistake that we make other than that is too tight. The sutures are too tight, and again, you have to worry about the ischemia of the tissue. Everything we do in obstetrics really is a balance between hemostasis and ischemia, and we always have to find just the right level to make sure that we're being as respectful as we possibly can be that we can be to that tissue, but at the same time get the hemostasis that we need. And if you're not sure that you've got it, or if you're worried about it, or if it's a really messy one, then get help, even if that means transfer. So, but you know, I know you guys are really good at this. I just offer this for your advice. The last thing that we often see is without a stool softener in somebody who gets constipated after delivery, it's so easy to pop one of those stitches. In any of those, the keyhole or the ischemia or the pop stitch all can lead to a small rectal fistula, which of course we want to avoid. And we'll talk about that again in a few minutes when I'm showing you the demonstrations. Is that okay? Okay. The next topic overlaps a little bit with what Marius was talking about earlier. And again, I'm going to show you a demonstration of how to fix the angle of a C-section. And I'm going to show it on a beef heart. So I hope that nobody's opposed to animal parts being in the room, but I think it's useful to see how you do it for that. When you have intraoperative bleeding, again, very superficially, but you always have to remember that if you have a postpartum hemorrhage, for example, that you've gone through the medical part of that. I'm not going to go through that today, but just be sure that you're following all the medical rules. Sometimes in the emergency, in the franticness to get that bleeding under control, people actually neglect to put in the oxy, or they neglect to get the hemobate or whatever they need. So always keep that in mind. And you always have to move quickly and confidently to make sure that you do it. Intrauterine balloon tamponade, you heard a little bit about that from Marius. We do deal with that in the SOO course as well. And I will be showing you the compression suture in a minute. And I'm showing you a model that I actually want you to all take home and practice on. So we'll be doing that in a few minutes. I absolutely agree with what Marius said this morning about uterine artery ligation. Absolutely, if you have to do that, you should be able to do that. But internal iliac artery ligation, if you fail to do it correctly, you can actually end up in so much worse trouble, and you're on the pelvic side while you're in a situation where you never, at the best of times, it's difficult to see what's going on. And at the worst of times, you can ding a nerve, you can ding another major vessel, and you can be in huge trouble. So I absolutely agree with Marius on not going anywhere near doing an internal iliac artery in any general situation. I wasn't really going to go over hysterectomy, especially since Marius hit the highlights of that today. And again, the subtotal, not taking the cervix out at the time of hysterectomy in an emergency situation, absolutely. Because it is that cervix. It's the cervix dissection that's going to get you into trouble. So what you're doing is you're amputating the cervix at the internal os, and you can literally do the whole thing with 5 clamps. And you can get yourself out of a life-threatening situation. Obviously, you never want to do that unless you're in a situation where you really feel you're going to lose her. But you know, it's one of those things. You can save a life. You can save a life without, without getting into trouble if you do it that way. Balloon tamponade. Does everybody have Backrys in their units? Has everybody used them? What do you think of them? I just want to tell you one stat about Backrys, which is absolutely amazing. And this is from BC Women's Hospital, so it's in a tertiary setting. BC Women's used to do somewhere between 7 and 10 hysterectomies a year for women for postpartum hemorrhage. They did them for other things like, cancers and everything too, but for postpartum hemorrhage, 7 to 10 a year. After Backrys and B Lynch's, 1 to 2 a year. So absolutely stunning in terms of the improvement in care and in improvement in the need to go to something like uterine artery ligation or hysterectomy. So please, it's a wonderful tool. And I think if there's anybody in the room that doesn't have access to Backry, the regular Backry, I mean, you can definitely build a Backry out of a condom and a red rubber if you need to. As we do that in Africa all the time. But if you are in Canada and you're doing obstetrics, you should have a proper Backry. And if you don't have the budget for it, talk to Marius. Okay. The B Lynch. So the B Lynch is really interesting. Again, it goes with Backry in terms of one of the most powerful but very simple tools that we've developed in the last 10 or 15 years, or at least it's older than that, that's come into common usage in the last 10 or 15 years and it's really gone to scale. So again, that everybody that's doing obstetrics should have access to the ability to do this. And that's why we actually really want to show you the model and make sure that you understand how to do it. How many people have done a B Lynch? Quite a few people, great, okay. Did you have any trouble with it? Did it work? Yeah, good, yeah. Okay, it usually works. And so I just wanted to share this with you. The last time I was in Tanzania I spent the month there in April, and we were really working with Kasulu, which is remote Western Tanzania, in a small hospital, and teaching the AMOs, the assistant medical officers, who have somewhere between 6 and 24 months of training, how to do C-sections. So that's what we're actually doing there. We're increasing the capacity of the system by teaching surgical skills. And so one of the things we always teach is village. And we went through, and we had one group of students, they were there for 3 days. We went home, and we got this Snapchat about a week later. So they had actually gone back to their hospital, which was even outside Kasulu, had a massive PPH, put in a B-lynch, saved the woman's life, and then sent us a picture the next week. So it was really interesting to think that this had happened. They'd never even heard of it before this course, and yet in a single day, we'd managed to teach them that. And it's such a simple thing to do, and I really think everybody needs to know and feel comfortable about it. So we'll do that demonstration when we move over to there. Angle extensions. How many people live in dread of something like an angle extension? So you have your C-section and then you have your angle extension. Absolutely. Marius mentioned something, and I'm going to show you on the beef heart this as well. If you stretch this way, it'll extend. If you stretch vertically, what happens? You don't get the lateral extensions the same way. But what we're going to talk about is if it does extend down to the angle, and from the edge of the incision extends down into the suture, into the cervix rather. How do you deal with that? How do you see it? What do you do about it? So I'm going to show you a quick example of that on the beef heart model. Again, the commonest thing that happens, and the reason people get into trouble with post-op bleeding in this situation, is because they don't recognize that it's happened, or they haven't got to the angle. Remember I said getting to the angle, which is one thing to remember. If you get to the apex and you close the apex and there's not a pinhole there, you're in better shape than if there's just even a small opening that you've missed at the end. So we'll look at that. You've seen this earlier as well, but you know the whole thing about this thing is that you want to keep centrally, you want to keep away from the pelvic sidewall, you want to keep away from the ureter. And again, that means as much as you can, you want to be sure that you always are moving everything centrally and up away from the pelvic sidewall every chance you can. We can talk a little bit more about that later too. So the extension usually and again, Mary's talked about this as well. The extension that happens at C-section usually happens at the time of the head extraction. And it has everything to do with putting in your hand and levering. And so, you know, when you put in your hand, if you're lifting, this is unlikely to happen. But if your lever, especially with your dominant hand, which is stronger, and you're doing this, the angle has just ripped up at the side of the incision. I'm left-handed, so it would be on, for me, the extensions would be on the right, but if you're right-handed, they'll usually be on the left side. Again, we'll go through that, and I'll show you on the CNIS model. Marius, you talked a little bit about that, so I think I'll just leave that one for now as well. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, but so I think what we'll do now is I will get you to mobilize, and please just come up to the front. I realize this is sort of a big group, but I think it's well worth gathering around. So can I keep this on? Okay, but this is not to the room, it's just to you, right? Okay. Yeah, I'll talk loud. Thank you. How's everybody doing? Having a good day? Oh, yeah, okay. So Yeah, I apologize. The group is a little bit bigger than I thought it was going to be, but I hope this is okay, and I hope this is fun for everybody. Okay, so talk about a simple model. Does everybody know what this is? It's a knee high, okay? But you can do it with any set. As long as it's pantyhose, you can do it with any kind, but the knee highs are just a little cheaper and better for this. So you take a knee high and you fill it full of foam, okay? And then you tie it off the bottom. And I have actually, in the course, of course, we actually have everyone actually place the sutures. I decided I wasn't going to try to do that in the middle of the course this afternoon because, well, first of all, I thought I might run out of time, and secondly, I didn't have the right needle, as you can see. This should be done with a big needle and a long suture. So I used up all my big needles and long sutures yesterday, and what I was left with was a little needle and a 27-inch suture, which does it, but just barely does it. If you have a 36-inch suture for this, it's absolutely perfect. So what you do, I put this, yeah. So what you do is, yeah, okay, sure. You can. I think people can hear it. If you can't hear, let me know, okay? I have the mic on for that. Okay. So what you do, this is your uterus. It's the model is actually labeled starting A, B, and then you come over the top, C, D, and then back over E, F. Okay, very simple. We do put an incision on it, but I'm sure everybody's aware of the fact that you can do a B Lynch whether or not you have an incision in the uterus, correct? Now, for the record, Lynch actually said that even if he wasn't doing a C-section, he would do an incision in the uterus so that he knew for sure that he hadn't sutured full thickness through the uterus. I don't think people regularly do that. If they're doing a B Lynch for a vaginal delivery, they don't do that, but he did, just for the record. A lot of the time you're doing it at C-section, so you already have the abdomen open, okay? If you do and your incision is open, then what you're trying to do is make sure that you go through and through, and then, like I said, I already told you what to do with it. And then once the suture's in place, what you're doing is you're actually having someone help you keep the uterus firmly down. Because what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're doing it with very even pressure and that the uterus is maintaining the contractility. Very good point, Stu. And so we talked about that yesterday as well. And there is a variation that you can do. And I've done that on this model. I didn't mention it because it's not B Lynch's model. But what we often do is we just pick up a little bit of the serosa of the top of the uterus, okay? Because as you're, and do you do that? Or? Yes, okay. But no, it's a variation, and I think it's good, and it's what we teach in the course. So I was going to mention that in just a second. So that while you're tying it down then, it's not going to slide off. Now, as you're putting that little stitch in there, you have to be really careful. It has to be very superficial, and you have to be sure that you're away from any vessels. Obviously, you should be, but also that you're not near the tubal implantation site. Okay. The other thing about a B Lynch, which is probably obvious to everybody, is that you would never do a B Lynch with a certain kind of suture. Non-dissolving. Why is that? Never get pregnant again, right? Yeah, and you'd think that the suture, as the uterus involutes further over the weeks, that the suture, even if it was a non-dissolving, would sort of loosen, but it doesn't. It stays sort of entrapped in the uterus itself. So it is a big problem. If you had inadvertently done this with a permanent suture, it can cause problems with subsequent pregnancy. So please always use a nice strong Vicryl. So this is a Vicryl 1. This is sort of the ideal suture. Some people use different sutures. Some people would do it with chromic, but I don't. What do you use, Niraj?
I use chromic.
Yeah. Yes, the big needle. Yeah. Yes.
And like, I'll never forget this, because when my staff people in residency told me, so the way you remember a Keats needle is that you think of like Alexander Keats, because by the time you're done, you want to go for a drink.
Actually, I'm just gonna.
So it's a straight needle with a big opening, so you can get any color or any suture that you want, and then you can just like put it right through. So that's the other one that you can't use.
Awesome. We use a monochrome on a CTX. It's a really nice big needle, and monochrome is pretty rapid.
So these are actually, these needles are my grandmother's, and they cost 29 cents. Interestingly enough. And this is the right size of needle. Okay. So again, I used up the actual needles yesterday in the course, but this is how big your needle is. It's big. And of course, the reason you want to do that is you want to get a good bite through the uterus and make sure that it's deeply implanted. So and you want to be able to get that compression. The other thing that's a little bit different in this model than Lynch's model is he just went down, came across the back, and then back up. Most people actually take a bite on one side, go across, and then back up. And it's just a personal variation. And as Mary has pointed out this morning too, there's a lot of different ways you can do this. You can do the placental bed, you can do a lot of different things. But this one, I like it because it's so simple and it's so difficult to get into trouble with this model. And it works, it really works, so it's really good. So as I said, between the Bacri, which I'm not going to show you, and this, we have managed to, in Canada, reduce the number of deaths and the number of hysterectomies from postpartum hemorrhage significantly.
I think the first point to mention is I didn't learn like
Yes. Yeah.
And the patient actually developed necrosis, ischemia. She developed a uterocutaneous fistula.
Oh, that's not good.
Not good.
But that's a very good point. It's very difficult to do this on a well-contracted uterus.
You don't have to, right? But yeah, on a boggy uterus, it's really, it's like butter. They just go right in, and then you get the effect you want. So yeah.
Just on that, we had a then we transferred her out. She came back to our community, and also ischemia. How do you balance, bleeding control versus 2 times? Is there a golden rule or rule of thumb, or how would you balance that out?
It's a very good question, and that's, like I say, it's the dilemma not just in postpartum hemorrhage, but in literally everything we do in obstetrics gynecology. I mean, postpartum hemorrhage is a life-threatening condition. You have to get it under control. So if you can do it, you're contracting
the uterus, you're making it a little bit tighter at a time. And now if you're at the point now where the bleeding's slowing down and you think you're actually getting some secondary tone, you don't have to really ream it right down. So there's not an ideal. The ideal is you stop the bleeding. So it doesn't have to look like a 12-week uterus or anything. In fact, I've seen them where they still look like 20-week uteruses, and they've gotten the desired effect. Okay, so that's one of the things it's a very good question though, and it is a big dilemma. So I'm just going to put a pair of, I might need a hand here. Can I have a volunteer? It's just that once I put my gloves on, I get this heart out. What I'm going to do is,
ever a situation where you would go a Bacri and
yes.
get pressure from the
Yes, you can. Does anybody, who's done a B-Lynch and a Bacri together? Have you done a B-Lynch and a Bacri? We had one case at Women's where they did actually go up and put the balloon in. So the question is which you do first. Yeah. So once you have the Bacri, once you have the sutures in, you don't have much room in there. But actually, if you have the Bacri, it's also really hard to get the sutures cinched down. You put, yes, that's what's usually recommended if you're going to use the 2 of them together. But by that time, you really are in the situation where you're thinking, what's going on here? And you're actually probably at that point setting up for hysterectomy. But again, it's rare. It's rare. Have you ever done both? Bakri and B. Lynch? You want to comment on it? He does have. You want to comment on it?
Lower segment.
Yeah.
So that at the back, because sometimes the
Yeah.
fineness gets down, but if the lower segment is atonic and it's hard to do with the.
So I was saying, put the Bakri and do the B Lynch and then blow up the balloon. Is that what you would do, or what? How would you do it?
I know it's filled up the balloon, but I left the balloon in.
Oh, no, I know, but I mean, you can't inflate the balloon and then do the B Lynch. That's what I'm saying.
Also, you might put a needle through the inflated balloon,
Yes.
and then that's pointless.
That's very good.
Yeah, I think that's the balloon at the top. We're looking at the whole thing.
I put the needle through the inflated balloon.
That's
so
funny.
my lesson learned. Inflate the balloon after, but I'm not so sure I was thinking 100% logically at the time. I was just trying to do everything, so that was my life.
Yeah, and you know what, you're trying to do everything. And you're actually trying to do everything to save that uterus. When you're trying to do everything to save that woman, and then you're trying to do everything to save her reproductive career from future catastrophe if you can avoid it by avoiding it.
I think it helps actually cut down on the process because there's not such a tendency to push down so much with the suture on the outside because you have something to push against.
Push against, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so I know that I haven't been involved in them personally because I was off running the hospital, but there's been a whole bunch of cases in the last year where people use both, and they've all been successful. I think there was one hysterectomy out of over a dozen cases. So, okay, so I do apologize for the fact that this was defrosted yesterday, but it's not that bad. So I want to show you one thing first, and I'm going to turn it over and yes, thank you very much. Okay, so remember Marius was telling you about the, you make the incision and then you extend it. Oh, sorry, actually that's not the right piece. Here it is. The hotel is going to be really mad at me at the end of this day. Okay, so here you can see, this is, Nesters actually didn't give me 2 intact beef hearts, but they gave me 2 whole beef hearts, but they weren't all in one piece. So here you can see I've made my incision. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to show you, and it is striated. The reason we use beef hearts when we use our models, as the people that were in the course yesterday will tell you, is because it's a beautiful striated muscle, and it's about the same a turgor as a postpartum uterus. And I did make the comment that it's more like a cuvalier uterus, but it's still about the same. And it's great to teach students how to suture uterine muscle by using beef hearts. That's why we use it. Okay, so here's your little incision. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull it this way. Okay, so see what's happening? It's extending, but I'm getting muscles going in 2 different directions, okay? Okay, so now I'm going to extend it this way. Whoop, almost went right through. So so you can see that it's actually torn over to the side. Actually, it was supposed to actually tear right in, and it did. Took a minute. So much easier to tear laterally when you do it this way. Hardly any lateral extension when you do up and down. So pretty amazing, really, when you think about it. And that's something that's just sort of emerged in the literature in the last 5 to 10 years. And it's actually made a big difference in terms of angle extensions. The people at Nesters were a bit upset with me, and they said, "Are you going to eat that?" So I told them, I promised I wouldn't eat them. Yeah, as small as you possibly can. Really, blunt dissection, that goes back to what I was going to say about the gentle C-section. Anytime you can use blunt dissection, you're actually using nature to your advantage. So you're actually splitting the tissue the way it wants to be split. So anytime you use sharp dissection, it's actually more traumatic to the tissue. I mean, sometimes obviously for precision you have to do that. And certainly with a repeat C-section, it's a different ball of wax. But when you're going through virgin tissue, you can do that. You can get away with it. Okay, so here I've made an incision. in the beef heart. A little bit of I don't think there's evidence for that yet, but there is a Cochrane review that's underway right now to look at that, and I think we'll see that coming out in the next little while. Right now, it's just about extensions. Okay, so here's my uterine incision. Everybody see this? Sorry, I feel like I'm okay. And so here, I've got the baby out, and now this is where I need somebody to can somebody please just hand me my scissors, a pair of scissors? Great, thank you. Just so I don't have to scoop everything up. Okay, so this is actually not me cutting. This is the baby's head extending. Okay. Okay, so here we got an angle extension, and it goes down a long way. Okay. So where's the corner of your incision? Down here. Okay. Where's your anatomic? Where do you have to match it up? At the edge of yes, at the angle, right? So I'm just going to get a little help again. If you could just get me a suture. I thought I had one out here, but I don't know what I did with it. Great, thank you. So I'm just going to show you this in terms of how you actually expose it. Thank you. And there should be a long needle driver in this pile here. That'll do. That's great. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so this is not your, that's okay. Okay, so the biggest mistake that people make is this. So here's your corner, and people do this and get a dog ear over here, okay? So one of the things that I've learned, and I'm sure my colleagues will back me up on this, is if you can get a suture, did I do this? There we go. Into the corner of what you know is your incision. This is easier said than done sometimes, just for the record. You know at that point, you've got nice thick myometrium, okay? You know where you are, you know where you're not in trouble in terms of your landmarks. So let's just grab that right there. So that's the corner of the incision before before the tear happened, okay? Okay, so let's pull that up and see where we are. Okay, now you know where you are. You can't possibly get into any trouble. You know that the vessels are well away. Okay, so now what's going to happen? You can either just do it in one throw, or you can do a figure of 8 or put a second throw in. If it's really thin, I usually put a second throw in because then you've done what Marius was talking about earlier. You've sort of distributed the force a little bit more, so it's less likely to tear. Okay, so now you're holding this, and you've massively expanded your ability to see down to the bottom of the tear, okay? So all of a sudden you can see, you can use this as leverage, and you can see down to the bottom of the tear. Now, the biggest mistake that people make, as you know, is not getting down to the bottom of this tear, okay? So what you can do is, so I'm going to just pretend I've tied this off because I'm not going to put another suture on. And I'm going to move this down now. Okay, so you can do the same thing in terms of just using this traction. When you get down to the bottom, you pick up what you think is the bottom of it, okay, through and through, and then you can tent that forward. Okay. Yes, that's what you'll do, but you can't see it yet. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pull this forward like this, and now you can see that you're half a centimeter from the end. You can see exactly where you are. And again, it's a little hard to see, but you get the concept that you're pulling the uterus over so you can actually, and you're pulling it away from the, remember we talked about always pulling up and centrally, so you're pulling away from the big vessels and the critical structure. So you're pulling centrally, and now you can see whether or not you're at the apex of the tear. and then you compare it. Yes, absolutely. So if you have a tear that badly, you can do that, and most people would at that point. But you don't have to. But if you don't know for sure where you are, you should be exteriorizing the uterus. I think everybody would agree with that. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So here you go with your hand in behind, and you're again pushing forward, and now you can see exactly where you are. But yes, I didn't say that, but by this time, if I had this sort of tear, I absolutely would have done that. Yeah. Is that helpful? Okay, so everything you're hearing from me today is about how you put a stitch in and you use it for leverage to make sure you got to the pinhole end of it, and then you go past the end of it, and then you see whether or not your repair is proper. Okay. Okay. So now, everybody happy with the beef heart? So I'm going to put this down now. I'm going to take my gloves off. Yeah, Nestor's made me promise I wouldn't eat it, but I'd already decided that was not going to happen. Could you hand me that? Yes, please do.
Postpartum hemorrhages that don't want to stop. Got to give it within 3 hours of delivery, and that's with vaginal or surgical postpartum bleeding. Don't forget tranexamic acid. 1 gram IV. It's the new buzzword.
Do you often give that pre-op? Because I did see a study that decreased the blood loss. I think it was like 230 mils.
So the latest SOGC journal has an article on that, and they basically say we don't have enough evidence yet for giving it for everybody pre-operatively. So that's not the plan.
And for your higher risk, so the patient has been in labor for a long time.
I hear what you're saying. Not recommended yet. So it's mentioned. But certainly, once you've got bleeding, don't forget to give it within the first 3 hours. Makes a significant difference. Yes. Yes.
I think in June.
Yes, it's brand new.
It's brand new.
We've been using it for years. Brand new.
Well, we use it for menstrual bleeding for many, many years. Yeah. So, okay, the last thing I'm over time. I knew this would happen, but at least I hope you're having as much fun as I am. Yeah. Okay. So this is a model for cervical tear, and when we're actually teaching the course, what we do, of course, is we have the vulva on it. But for the purposes of this, that's not helpful. And so I just want to show you. So what we teach the students to do is to walk around the cervix with 2 ring forceps. Everybody
with that, right? Okay. So here, I can tell you in this model, there is a tear. And it's right over here at 3 o'clock. So what's the biggest problem in terms of cervical tear repair? What's the biggest mistake people make? Seam, nothing at the apex. That's right. What's the second biggest mistake people make with a cervical tear? Sorry? Not identifying it for sure. Okay, there's one other thing that I just wanted, over-sewing, exactly. So if you look at this, remember, I mean, that nice piece of red felt, it looks very, very pristine, but essentially, when you get to the corner, it's not going to look like, it's not a right angle, right? You get to the corner, and if you keep sewing, you can be completely lost in terms of where you are. You will not know that you're here, right? So I guess the advice here is really put the stitches in, stop the bleeding, take a deep breath, and wait a couple of minutes. Because then even within a couple of minutes, the cervix starts to look like a cervix. And you'll start to be able to see what's tear and what's physiologic cervix, okay? I saw a person in my practice who had had her whole cervix stitched with a pinhole left at the side away from the tear. And actually, I don't think, well, it was recognized that the cervix was narrow, but it was a huge problem, obviously. She ended up with cervical stenosis. We ended up having to treat her for that. But it's more easily done than you might think. So over suturing is the second biggest mistake that people make. So my advice there is identify the apex. Again, the same trick as we talked about with the last one, put the suture in, pull it down. And you can see the apex once you've pulled it down. Go above where your first stitch is, make a figure of 8 and tie it off, or you don't even have to. You can tie the first throw and then go above it and make sure then that you're above the angle of the tear, okay? Deep breath. Just think for a minute, just sit for a minute, and then resume after you have a better sense of where your landmarks are. Any questions or comments or anything? I'm rushing because I'm
just thinking that one would do a cervical gap.
I know,
Your
yeah,
repair.
I know.
I know.
Is there quite a wide variation in how much dilation you'd have? I mean, it depends how much time.
Yes, so I'm sure when they finished suturing the
Yeah.
cervix, it wasn't a pinhole.
Yeah.
But it was definitely asymmetrical because you could see where the scar crossed the midline. But I'm sure they'd left a reasonable opening, but it was, as it involuted, it was off center and became a pinhole cervix as a result. So no, I'm sure that what was left was probably an opening like this. It was just that.
Yeah, so you can't just trust feeling, you really have to.
You have to, yeah, exactly. And I mean, the other thing is that it's better to undersew slightly than oversew, unless it's bleeding. The main reason you're fixing the tear is to stop the bleeding. And you want to have some semblance of normal anatomy, but that's secondary. Once you get the bleeding controlled, you're not in trouble and it's not an emergency. That's the cervical model that I wanted to talk about. I do have a little model for the 4th degree tear, but it's sort of hard to see. But the idea of the 4th degree tear, again, the theme is that you have to get to the top and make sure that you don't leave a pinhole at the top. So I guess if I was going to give you one pearl to take away today, our biggest mistake is that we do leave that pinhole. And it can lead to bleeding, but it can also lead to fistula, it can lead to pain, it can lead to infertility, it can do all sorts of things. So really be careful that when you finish your repair, you know exactly that you've repaired the whole tear wherever it is. I don't know. Am I done? Is it time?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's time. That's what I sorry. Okay, so I was hoping that we'd leave more time for questions and comments, but
we've got all of the coffee hour or the coffee
Okay.
hour for questions because you're right up against coffee.
yeah, okay, good. I'm done.
Thank you.
Okay.